So I was cruising around on Reddit, as sometimes do, and I came across a very interesting AMA with a former Sony employee who was part of the Vita team and worked with them, and he gave a lot of interesting insight into what was going on at Sony during the whole process, what happened. So I thought it'd be kind of cool to kind of talk about some of the key things that happened with the Vita, like where it failed, why some decisions were made, and just generally talk about it. Before we get started, did you own a Vita?
I own the PlayStation TV. I never owned a Vita.
You were one of the 3 people that owned a PlayStation TV?
Yeah, because I wanted to play Vita games without having a handheld, because I play on a TV like a normal person. I like having a functioning neck.
Ah, I see. Yeah, I had like the first iteration, like the OLED PlayStation Vita with like the proprietary charger and everything. It was great. I loved it. It was a great console.
I never been much a handheld gamer, so it's always been a struggle for me. Like, I've had a PSP given to me. I had a 3DS just because I really liked the look of it, and it was a Persona 3DS. But, like, I don't play a lot of games on my phone still to this day, so handhelding has just kind of been one of those things where it's... I mean, I drive everywhere, so it's kind of pointless for me to have a handheld for the most part, considering the only time I would ever use a handheld is outside of my apartment, which is barely never because I'm driving to those places.
Yeah. No, I totally get that. Like, what was your experience with, like, initial impressions before we get into this? Like, what was your thoughts on the Vita and, PlayStation Vita TV or whatever? Like, where do you fall on that?
I thought the Vita was fine, like, when it first got announced, because I'm like, okay, makes sense. It's going to be a much stronger PlayStation Portable. You can get some bigger games on there. Like, they're trying to compete with Nintendo. Like, it made sense. And then when it clearly didn't work, they went with the PlayStation TV, and it went, okay, cool, now I can at least play some of these games that I've missed out on, because there was games like Persona 4 Golden, there was Freedom Wars, there was the first 2 Trails of Cold Steel games. Like, there was a lot, especially in the Japanese market, because that's the one thing that kept that console alive for so long, was the Japanese market. I think they still even make games right now in Japan for that system.
Yeah, if they aren't, like, it just recently ended. So
yeah, like, Japan loves their mobile market, so it made sense there. But, like, for me, it was just the stretch of games that I'm like, I wish I could play you, but you're only on this handheld that I'm never going to touch. And then Sony's like, hey, for like $80, you can just get this little tiny piece of plastic and you can play it on your TV. Sold!
Yeah.
And so I played like 5 games on it, but it was worth it.
Yeah, so one of the things that did come up, that a lot of people have a problem with the Vita, was the lack of games. So people ask, like, why weren't there a lot of games on there? And so someone just kind of said, and one of the questions was, why is it that Sony dropped first-party support? There were so many games on the PS3 or PS4 that could have gotten decent ports that they really rocked, e.g. Unreal 3 games, but the number of games that really show what it's capable of is quite small. And so the Redditor, whose name is former Sony dude, says the ROI just wasn't there. Market penetration was weak. While they made earnest efforts to make games in the beginning, when those numbers didn't improve, they stopped investing. The PS3 outsold the Vita 4-1, and the PS4 outsold the Vita 5-1. As a Vita fan, it sucks, but Sony as a business was targeting areas where sales potential was higher and mostly left Vita to the third-party partners. They still made money on every sale, so they were largely happy with accepting it as a passive income for most of Vita's life cycle. So that was, everyone was kind of saying, like, why are we not seeing a lot of these, first-party games on the Sony hardware? And fact of the matter was there just wasn't an ROI on it.
And I mean, realistically, too, like, the comparison is that as of today, or this article is from 2018, I should say, 16 million Vitas sold. Yeah. Whereas 3DS sold 70 million. And again, it doesn't tell me where these things sold. So realistically, I'm willing to say more than half are probably just Japanese. So in North America, or even not even North America, the rest of the world, there's likely at most, if we're being generous, 10 million customers for them to go to. That's not enough if you're a AAA publisher. You're not going to port a game on Vita for the potential of like a few million people to buy it. And that's even probably being generous, because I doubt it. It's probably more like 6 million people in the rest of the world. I'm willing to go out there and say Japan probably paid like the majority of these because that was their console.
Yeah, but it's hard to say because this is one of those chicken and the egg things. Like, was no one buying the consoles and the games because they weren't making them, or, could they still have made them and nothing happened? Like, I think it's a
bit of both, honestly. I think in the early days, it was just they put a lot into it, but people weren't really into it because Nintendo already owned that market pretty well. And then as soon as, people started realizing that, oh, it's not selling well, so then we'll stop wasting money on these games. And around the same time, people went, oh, the game library on Vita is kind of dead.
Yeah.
I really think it's probably a mixture of both. It's just what happened first and to what extent.
Yeah. I think one of the major gaps for Sony, or for people buying it, was the proprietary memory cards. Like, do you remember those cards?
I do, because they were dumb. And it was a story that was said for a while and never really got addressed, because I think Sony just went, well, we got to make money back somehow.
It was brutal how, like, those cards were so expensive. Like, I remember for the longest time I could only afford like a 4 gig memory card, and then eventually I think the 32 came on sale and I got one. But yeah, like it was like $120 for like 16 or 32 gig like memory cards.
And you think about what $120 gets you now in an SSD on a computer. So it's like
not even like now, but even back then, like the price of an SD card was drastically cheaper than what, a PlayStation Vita memory card was.
Yeah, there was that too.
Yeah, so one of the things that they did ask, they kind of said like why did Sony continue with proprietary memory cards after it became obvious how much of an obstacle it was for potential buyers? Former Sony dude says that the proprietary memory cards were actually a result of the Sony hack from like 2011 or 2012. Sony became really paranoid about hacking and all that stuff, and so that's why they ended up creating the proprietary memory cards.
To which I say, no one cares about hacking. Jesus Christ.
Well, you got to think about it. Like they, think about the PSP. Like that thing got hacked quite a bit, and I think by having this memory card that is hard to, transfer or copy things on, harder to put on software that would allow you to emulate or to build.
But Nintendo didn't have that problem. And if they did, it didn't matter. So I think it comes down to two, is like you weren't selling enough. And you probably would have sold more if it was something that people could homebrew.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, look, how many... Let's be completely honest here. This is a fun, like, tangential question. How many people actually bought a PlayStation Classic because they wanted to play PlayStation games, or because it was a really cheap mod device?
Yeah.
A lot of PlayStation Classics just sold because people knew that they could use it for that. There's still a plus sometimes to letting things go like that. But in the case of, like... I don't really care that hacking might have become a problem with the Vita. You still would have, to the average customer, sold plenty more Vitas if it was more accessible to them. If they realize that, like, I can buy this handheld and not have to spend $150 just to be able to basically have more than 2 games on it.
Yeah. So coming to the end of, like, switching over towards the end of the PlayStation Vita, people are starting to ask, like, the idea of the PlayStation Vita store shutting down, like, has it been something that has been planned? And talking about hacking and stuff. So one Redditor asks, has Sony been planning this shutdown for a while, or did they decide recently to pull the plug? Developers were left in the dark. It seems very sudden, so any insight would be interesting. Former Sony dude responds, it's been a while in the making, but when I left, there was still some concrete data. As soon as the firmware was broken in 2016 or 2017, it was on the chopping block. After the nightmare that was the 2011 hack, Sony was terrified of the word hack or any potential network intrusions. Fun fact, the PSP was actually planned to have trophies until that firmware was broken and they dropped it like a hot potato. So they kind of talk about the fact that, the hack had a huge impact on Sony, and like I can see why they're, protective of their infrastructure. If they have a way that people can kind of use these handhelds to get into the system, like that could be a problem.
Yeah.
Do I think that it's worth shutting down the store because it's been hacked? Like, no, it's been hacked now for it's been broken for 5 years now. Like, if something was going to happen, it's going to happen. So I don't know if that's a justified reason for them to do it, but that's at least...
It's like we've said before in the issue of, like, piracy and stuff, too. Like, just because a few people do it doesn't mean you should be alienating, like, the other, like, 95% of your customer base that aren't.
Yeah. So kind of closing down, like, why did the Vita fail, according to this Redditor? So they ask, why did they fail? Or sorry, one of the things that they did talk about is like, if the Vita was failing, like, why did they do something like the PlayStation Vita TV? And he goes on to say that it was pretty much a salvage attempt, and that it was easier to build a new, cheap, system instead of getting like the HDMI out to be working on the original OG Vita. And it kind of addresses some of the concerns about price point, like you didn't need to have the memory card or whatever. So it was kind of a way to salvage it, and that's why the PS TV came out, but kind of wasn't really supported. And then they kind of go on to finish, why he thought that they, or like why him and Sony thought if they did like postmortems or anything. And so generally the idea was is that they did do postmortems, but there wasn't any sort of consensus. Did Sony give up too early on the PlayStation Vita? Was the market ready? Would the market ever be ready? Yeah, and so that's kind of the big takeaway from it. So they kind of all had different ideas of like what it could have been, and it just, yeah, there's no real consensus amongst Sony as to why it did fail. And so my question to you, Adam, is like, was the PlayStation Vita destined to fail?
Yeah.
Yeah. Why do you say so?
Nintendo. There's not really a easier way to say it. Well, I guess there's not a more complicated way of saying it. Nintendo just owns that market, and they have since like ever. Nobody's really challenged them. Like PlayStation Portable might have had a good run, but in the end, like Nintendo just went, nope, DS, 3DS, and that was it. Because Game Boy already had it. Game Gear tried, didn't do very well either. So they were going into a market that they were going to have to be number 2 in no matter what. They were never going to be able to trump Nintendo because Nintendo was just churning out way too much at that point. There was no way you were competing. So you're already on an uphill battle. And then when the idea is you're going to be supported by a big library and that library fades, well, you're already screwed. And then on top of that, the memory card issue, and it just kept compounding from there. Like, realistically, in retrospect, like, there's no way that this thing ever could win. Even if you did the simulation like 1,000 times, I think it fails every single time. And it's not even necessarily their fault for all of them. There are a few weird decisions in there, but it just becomes a matter of, like, you couldn't trump the king. It's in the same vein of, like, every MMORPG minus, like, Final Fantasy XIV that ever tried to go up against Warcraft and win. You can't. So all you can do is try to find your niche, and then that's it. Because Nintendo already found the market for that. In the same vein that, like, they knew that they can't compete console-wise anymore, so they made the Switch because they knew that they could carve out their niche. Vita just tried to be a competitor, in my eyes, by just being a stronger device with better games, except the games went away, which was their only selling point at that point.
See, I disagree. I mean, I do think that the Vita was doomed to fail from the moment it was like not in the moment it was revealed, but like by the time it was released, like the cards were already set. Like I think there were some weird decisions that were made. I think like having the touch screens was a problem, especially the rear touch screens. Like it was a pain in the ass.
I forgot about that thing.
Right. So like it was in a weird market because like this was like right around the time that like mobile games were taking over, and like everyone thought that was the future of gaming. So I think they were like felt compelled to have that touch component, and I think that was a detriment. I think if they had tried to replicate it so that like one of the things that I wanted when I was looking at the PlayStation Vita is like I love the fact that it had like dual analog sticks. Like that was a huge game changer. And I feel like what they needed was one of the problems that they had is that they never had those R2 and L2 buttons. They had the R1s and the R1 and R1 and L1. They didn't have the second one. So if they had had those second triggers, this would have become an instant, great remote play tool.
But how thick would that handheld have to be then to facilitate that? That's the only worry about it, right?
Even if it wasn't a full size, but even if it was just like somewhat smaller, like a truncated version, or even like bottom pads or something, like just having that second controller to make it almost replicate what a DualShock 3 or a DualShock 4 had felt like, it would have made it really easy for them to sell this as, hey, it's a remote console, it's a handheld console, or it can be its own little game. And then you start having situations where, the game can play exactly like that. But if you play like Uncharted, and then suddenly like artifacts you find show up on the screen or something like that, like there was cool ways of doing that. But I felt like they kind of just got close to the finish line and then just totally went off the rails by doing like, having it so you have motion controls in there and then you have touch screens and not replicating the controller. The other thing I think that was a huge issue was the proprietary memory cards. I think that really killed it because it's, hey, here's this $250 device, because I think that's what it cost us here in Canada. And then on top of that, yep, you're going to have to buy a memory card, and yep, you're going to have to buy these games. And so it was kind of like, it really pissed a lot of people off, and I think that was a thing to deal with it. I don't think Nintendo had the cornerstone of the market. Like, yeah, they're the market leaders, but I think there was a drive for a more mature style gaming experience. And
well, I mean, I think they had the opportunity to do it, but once the games faded away, like, it was gone. Like, the only way you're going to beat Nintendo with their own game was by being different. And when the games go away, like, Nintendo had their Japanese market too, and that was really what the Vita market was left with. So having JRPGs on a Vita is not going to suddenly make people go away from a 3DS, because they can get most of those games similarly on the 3DS.
So thinking about it, like, do you think that Sony should ever attempt or will attempt a PS Vita 2?
If they do, they have one option of doing it, and it's quite simple. You take this thing, which is the DualSense 5, for anybody not watching the video portion of this. You extend the thumbsticks out a little bit, or not the thumbsticks, the handheld, the hand parts. I don't know what you want to call this bit. The little bits that you hold your hand on, the handles. I guess that works. You widen it out a bit, you put a screen in there, and that's it. And it's not a console, it's just a streaming handheld for your PlayStation. That's it. If you try to make a separate console with its own separate library, it will fail every single time. I don't think there's a way that they can do that again. I think the only way you make a Vita 2 is it has to, quite frankly, be either a PlayStation Now device or a PlayStation 5 remote device, and that's it.
Yeah, like, I'd love to see another PlayStation.
I love to see it too. I just don't think it's feasible.
I don't think it's necessary, though, too. I think with the way that Remote Play now works, that I can play PlayStation on my phone, I can play it on my, tablets.
Well, if you can make it cheap enough, I think you can make it worthwhile. Like, if you can make it under $200, then it would feel similarly to a DualSense, then maybe you can get away with it. But otherwise, like, that's really the only thing that you could possibly get people's attention with, is just being like, hey, you want to play your games just wherever you go? Just basically be a PlayStation Switch. Like, that's the only option they have.
Yeah, they'd have to create like a streaming device so that, yeah, maybe that's what it looks like, is it's just basically we just took all the internal components of your cell phone and we just made it into a handheld, that looks like the controller. I mean, they already have those things already, but like, maybe it's one of those things where you don't want your phone, or like,
I mean, technically the Vita can remote play a PS4 already.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's just an upgrade, and obviously, like, I've never been a fan of the design of the PSP or the Vita. I don't like the way that it feels, because it feels like I'm holding like a dinner plate that just has buttons on it.
Yes. Yeah, it needs a little bit of like that curvature on the back.
That's what I mean. Like, if you model it similar to the controller, because we've seen that with some people trying to do. I think Nvidia did something with the Shield, I think it was called, where they had a similar thing where it felt like a joystick. Or not a joystick. I keep not saying handles. It's so hard. But like, to replicate like a lot of gaming, like, I could never imagine going back to, like, that's another part of the 3DS and stuff that I didn't like either. It's a freaking square. It's like I'm playing NES controllers all over again. Like, I don't miss square edge controllers.
Well, this is the same. I find that even with the Switch, I find that the Switch is so, like, because I don't have like the Joy-Con controller thing. I just use the Joy-Cons that come with it, and I find that those are very small and very dinner platey again, where like you don't have that shape to your hand.
Yeah.
And I don't even have that big of hands, so like.
And well, I mean, I can't even imagine playing any of these games on my phone either. So I mean, that's just me. But
well, I've seen things like the Backbone and stuff where you can like put your phone in and it has basically what you're describing. It's got the shape of a controller.
Yeah, there's ways around it, but like, point blank, I know people who just play the games on their touch phone, and it's like, why?
I don't think you should be hanging out with those people.
No, I don't think I should either.
They don't sound like they're like thinking straight. Like, they're not all there.
Look,
like,
man, the pandemic affects a lot of people in different ways, all right?
That's a symptom of the vaccine. Suddenly you just play with touch controls.
Yeah. The side effects may include blood clotting and the inclination to play really good games on really crappy devices.